Our next session this morning involves some of the country's senior non-executive directors and chairs for a promised peek inside the boardroom to hear how they're approaching a whole range of challenges at the moment. And of course, as has been touched on this morning, there is such a range of challenges at this point in time that it does rather beg the question of just how long we've got, which is 60 minutes. So we're going to do the best that we can to traverse the territory and the issues that are facing boards. And of course, also take your questions. So please do send them in early and often, so I've got an opportunity to put them to our panel. So, to your panel for this session this morning. Immediately on my left here, Michael Wilkins, Chair of QBE Insurance Group, Chair of Medibank Private, and a Director of Centra. In the middle, Christine Holman, Director of Metcash, AGL Limited and Collins Food. And for the purposes of this panel, it's worth noting that Christine was previously a Director of CSR, where she overlapped with Rob Sindel, who is on her left, who at that time was CEO of CSR. And as well as being a former CEO of CSR, Rob Sindel is Chair of Mirvac, he's Chair of Aurora Limited and a Director of Boral. So please welcome our panel this morning. So as I said, there is a huge number of issues, and each of you do come from a different industry perspective. But I wanted to start by asking you, for the one thing beyond the normal bread and butter of boards today, the one thing across your boards that worries you the most, the monster in the cupboard, if you like. Rob, can I start with you?
Oh, I was hoping you'd start with Mike on that one. He might say cybersecurity, but I think, look...
It was an early dig.
I think there's a whole litany of issues, but I did say the word uncertainty, which everyone uses, but what I mean by that is probably two specific things at different organisations. The first one is what's happening in commercial property in the US. So it's a very specific issue, but it has huge ramifications for the world. And in the US, you can't get a loan to build an office tower. And the issue with that is that means there's potentially a lot of bad loans in the US banking system, which has ramifications right through the world. So that's one that keeps us awake at one particular board. The second issue for me is probably the big three themes that are emerging in Australia, and I think it's immigration, housing and the energy transition, but I'm sure we'll come on to those in a moment, Ali.
Let me just ask you a question about that. I mean, you talked about financing in the US, but when you've got this level of uncertainty, what does it do to board decision-making processes? Does it slow them down?
I think, unfortunately, it does. It slows a couple of things down. You as investors, superannuation funds, it slows the decision-making down because that uncertainty is very hard to predict. And that happens with international capital as well. So do I make an investment? When do I make that investment? And what's the timing around that? But that's what the job of organisations and boards is to make decisions at times of uncertainty. It's actually a great level of opportunity too, because if you can invest counter-cyclically, then that does generally outperform following the herd. So uncertainty, but that's our job, is to make decisions in times of uncertainty.
Christine, what about you? What's your monster in the cupboard, if you like? You work in very price-driven sectors.
Yeah, so, the obvious couple of things is the supply chain risks that we're managing in, certainly in a couple of my boards, the impact of inflation on costs and therefore margins, and really understanding where your supply chain risk lies and ensuring that you have incorporated those risks and are mitigating those risks in a timely way, because COVID really made that very evident that understanding where your single points of failure in your supply chain are is so important. The second big monster is labour shortages, not just from people on the front line, but almost at every level of the organisation, including the quality of talent at senior level and how long it's taking to actually fill some of these positions. But can I just add one thing that, for me, personally as a director, overarching all of this, that certainly keeps me up at night, is are we as directors and boards spending sufficient quality time and discussion at board meetings to understand whether we are managing the changing dynamics of the environment that we're operating to reflect the right strategy and the emerging risks in our organisation? You know, are we spending the right amount of time at board meetings to really understand, do we have the right strategy? Are we understanding the emerging risks? And most importantly, as custodians of shareholder capital, do we have a rigorous and disciplined approach to allocating capital? And the temptation through a cycle such as this, as Rob very rightly pointed out, the uncertainty and the volatility, is the temptation to cut capital allocation, to sort of manage through the cycle, or overspend on capital to buy growth. So really having a rigorous capital management plan in times of uncertainty is certainly something that is front and centre on my mind.
Well, let me just put the question to you. Are you spending enough time on working out whether you're...
I'd like to, and it's certainly something that, you know, almost all boards we are. This is a question that we're looking to, you know, obviously change in terms of how the agenda is planned.
Mike, what about you? Do you agree with that point from Christine?
Yes, I do. And I think that Rob and Christine have really enunciated what's on the mind of most boards around the risks that we're talking about. It's the uncertain environment that we're dealing in and how that plays out through an inflation perspective or other matters. And particularising, I guess, to the insurance sector, a couple of my boards are there, how that then plays into climate change, what's happening in that space. But more particularly, I think the things that boards are starting to discuss is the continuing relevance of their product or service to their customers. Things like affordability become really important to understand that, because we only exist because of our customers and we need to meet a need for those customers. So how we actually continue to stay abreast of that change and ask ourselves the question, are we genuinely meeting the needs of the customers? Because I think that's the key question around that sustainability. And the other thing that I would add here is just trying to balance the short-term imperatives that we're all facing with the longer-term need, because we're all charged as stewards of the organisation. We're charged with establishing the organisation for the longer term, and I think you've always got to find that balance. And Christine talked about some of the potential easy short-term decisions, but sometimes the easy decisions are not the ones you've got to take.
I know Rob's got a good example on this front, but let me ask you, Mike, who wins in that situation? Because there'd be a lot of people in the room who would say, actually, that short-term, long-term isn't really an equation, because if you only look at the short-term, you have no long-term.
Correct. Unfortunately, I think that sometimes organisations are influenced by a number of parties who have a shorter-term horizon and get influenced by that public perception, what's written in the media and a number of other things. And I think one of the things that boards have to do is to be prepared to fly in the face of what's sometimes publicly accepted short-term positions, to say we're managing this organisation for the long term and we have to make sure that it's established for that long term.
Rob, I know we talked offline about what happens when ESG rubs up against financials, which it always does. And at Aurora, you've had a really, I suppose, a real rubber hits the road example of that.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. The example is, so Aurora makes they make a lot of glass bottles. The wine industry in South Australia, we make every wine bottle for it. So we export wine bottles as well. It's a highly energy intensive business. It's basically gas. It's a process that's difficult to electrify, and it's one of the top 10 users of gas in Australia. Supports the wine industry, as we said. So presented to the board was two proposals. We need to replace those furnaces every 5 years, 95 million to replace the furnace like for like, and the gas usage would be similar, or 140 million to change the technology to leading edge technology, only one other furnace in the world which is based on a different technology. It's basically building an oxidation plant, an oxygen generation plant. And we looked at that as a board and said, okay, how do we make this decision on the basis that from our shareholders' point of view, we're going to spend $50 million more on a capital investment that may or may not have a similar return. There's no operational cost savings. Where we got ourselves there was that actually not only do we meet our regulatory framework by meeting our commitment to reduction in carbon emissions, but we believe our customers want us to have lower emission technology as well. I mean, there's a lot of other factors that go into that, but that's the sort of decisions where you're saying, I'm investing shareholders' money, I'm investing your clients' money. How do I make a decision to spend $50 million more without the data to back up the decision that, maybe somebody will pay 20 cents more for their bottle of wine, but will they pay $1 more for a bottle of wine? And that's the sort of decision that boards need to make.
So does that mean if you've made the $140 million decision that the shareholders are going to wear that for the immediate future? So that's short-term pain, long-term gain.
Absolutely, and to Mike's point, it's short-term, it's longer-term decision-making on the basis that there's external variables you can't actually compute, but you can make assumptions on that make the investment a sensible one relative to the like-for-like replacement.
Christine, do you reckon every company would make that decision?
Yeah. I think that firstly, almost every company faces a similar example that Rob's presented. And I think that there's another point here, and I'm sure Rob and his team looked at it as well, is what type of returns, thresholds, hurdles, do these investments that require companies to meet their ESG targets, emission targets, actually, are they consistent with traditional return on invested capital? So that is something that the board needs to consider and actually back themselves and stand behind that decision and communicate that very clearly to your stakeholders. So absolutely, it's not, I don't think that in all cases boards will make a similar decision, but they should, because you're looking at the long term. I think, and I commend Rob and his team for making that choice. I think one of the biggest challenges in ESG is really, ESG is about managing risk and understanding what those risks are. And if you accept that that is the premise, then that is got to be embedded in your strategy, and you've got to understand what the trade-offs are and what the financial imperatives are, and be very clear about why it is that you're making those decisions, and your ability to articulate that to your stakeholders is really important. And the biggest challenge is actually a mindset challenge, that ESG somehow sits outside the business, and it's not sitting outside the business. It is, I think AXI recently released its modern slavery report, and I loved a tagline in there that said, compliance without ambition. And I think we need to start thinking about ESG as managing risk, inherent in developing strategy, understanding what your trade-offs are, being very clear about how you articulate that position to your stakeholders, and it's not about compliance without ambition.
Can I just ask the sound guys, maybe we can change Christine's mic, because I think that there's a bit of something else going on that's making it hard for people to hear. Mike, can I just ask you a question about that? Because in theory, everything Christine says is what should happen. But in practice, when you've got really high inflation, you've got people hurting, you've got difficulty raising money, capital is difficult to put your hands on. There are so many challenges. What is that discussion like around a board table? We're going to spend 50 million more. We're not going to get a return for a couple of years. Our returns are not going to look so good. Our short-term targets for my remuneration are going to look pretty crappy. How does that conversation go?
I think that boards would still take the longer-term view. One of the great things that we're able to do is we can engage with our shareholders through a number of the organisations that are here and communicating that longer term. And I think if it fits in with the broader commitment that we've got to our stakeholders, because the shareholders are one stakeholder, but we do have a number of other very important stakeholders that we've got to consider, and it's actually balancing that. And I think organisations that are prepared to enunciate why they are making these decisions are the ones that can make them and can make them confidently if you put a good position forward. Of course, if the shareholders don't like it, there is an annual general meeting. There's an election for shareholders on a for directors on a regular basis, and you can get a different solution. And I can only speak from my experience, but I think that this perception that management teams would actually say, I'm going to maximise my short-term remuneration opportunity to the detriment of the long term for the organisation, I think that actually sells management short.
Of course, the whole discussion starting about your blast furnace, Rob, it all goes to meeting your net zero commitments. You're all on boards that have signed up to net zero. So I want to ask you about the climate transition, but in the context of what we touched on earlier this morning, and that's greenwashing. Rob, do you worry about greenwashing? Do you worry greenwashing could lead to green hushing in your own organisations?
Absolutely. I think what management teams and boards want to do is meet those goals that clearly is an expectation of society. The danger in that is sometimes you don't have the technology to get there. So it's really important you're honest to say, look, we can, and Aurora is a really good example, we can see a pathway to 2030 and 2035, but we've got no idea how to get from 2035 to 2050 because, you know, the energy intensity of a glass furnace cannot be replaced by electrical energy. You can't generate 1,450 degrees from electricity from that process. So how are we going to get the rest of the way? And I think one of the other concerns that boards are staring into is to say, look, just simply going and buying international offsets doesn't pass the pub test. It doesn't feel right. You know, we've all seen the horror stories about what may be happening in PNG and other places. So I think that's the piece that that concerns me is what do we do past 2030 or 2035, depending on the organisation. And we've been quite explicit. This is our target, but honestly, we don't know how to get there yet.
Christine, do you think that greenwashing, I mean, sitting on a board, you have to trust you have to trust what you're given to a point, but how big an issue do you think it's going to be for companies?
I think, it very clearly, I mean, I think the ASIC did a sweep of companies recently, I think.
Superannuation funds?
Yeah, and it was interesting findings there, but absolutely every director that sits on the board, when we look at, net zero targets or ambitions that are set out, there's intent and clear action, pathways, how are we going to get there, and being very transparent about actually we don't know what we don't know, to Rob's point. But where there is data, making sure it's the trust but verify. How are you going to verify the data? Your third-party providers that support some of that data validation, making sure that you, as a board or an audit committee or a safety and sustainability committee, have the right controls in place and checks and balances that ensures that when you put that target and the number and what you've achieved for the year on paper in your report for in the public domain, that it's absolutely substantiated. And if it can't be substantiated, then you need to explain why. The transparency is the key to trust. If you're open enough saying, look, we are on a journey right now, we're still nascent in our ambitions for this particular target. To Rob's point, we know that this current technology exists and we're going to trial it or pilot it, and maybe in 5 years' time we'll get there. Those are the kind of narratives that, you can stand behind.
Mike, let me ask you a question that's come in from the audience, but is something that I would absolutely put to you. Do you think that investors really appreciate what net zero means in financial terms? And I remember a number of years ago, a very well-known Australian chair said to me that she didn't think they had any idea what net zero means in a cost sense.
I think we're all learning. still, Ali, is the answer to that, and it's going to be different for each organisation. Some, such as the operations that Rob's involved with, are very emissions intensive. Others, though, are relatively light, particularly those in the financial services sector. If you look at the Scope 1 emissions, they're negligible, and you can see an easy pathway to get to net zero for those operations. It's what happens in Scope 2 and Scope 3. And bringing it to the insurance sector, I guess, it becomes important to understand how the industry more broadly is going to achieve net zero in conjunction with its customers by 2050. And that's not clear, to Rob's point and Christine's point. That's certainly not clear, but there needs to be a pathway to say how we're going to get there. QBE was the first Australian insurer to sign up to the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, which is the largest insurers in the world that are talking about how we actually get our underwriting portfolios to be to net zero. And part of that is a little unpalatable for investors in the short term, because we probably need to support some organisations to get to the other side, rather than saying we're going to cut you off cold turkey, which I don't think is in the longer-term interests of our shareholders, nor in the longer-term interests of the community more generally.
Which goes to the issue of stewardship and divestment.
Ali, I think there's another piece that we don't talk enough about, is we've all actually got to take personal responsibility, because these emissions aren't for company's sake. They're actually everything that a company or industries produce is ultimately for a consumer. And changing our own personal behaviour is going to be a huge part of the net zero equation. So, not driving your car, catching public transport, to not use your dryer at home, to install solar, improve your insulation. These are all personal responsibilities that we all need to take, because ultimately companies can't do it alone. It's our own behaviour which ultimately takes which generates the emissions. So I think it's a big challenge for everyone to get their head around.
Mike, if I can go back to monsters under the bed, and I wonder if I had asked you for your monster a year ago, you would have said cybersecurity. Did you think that you had all your bases covered?
Well, I was waiting for you to get to that question.
Of course you were, yeah. As was everyone else.
No, look, I think that the last 6 months or so has been a very steep learning curve for me and for a number of other people. Cyber was a risk, and I think all boards are very well aware of that, and people in the community are increasingly becoming aware of it as well. But until you're actually living through that experience and understanding it, I think it's not quite as stark as it is if having lived through an event. But I'd have put it in a basket a year ago, whereas I think it's a particular risk. But I don't think that boards or indeed companies should get hung up and say we're just going to concentrate on cyber and nothing else, because I think it's one of a number of risks that we face, and it has to be managed like all risks. And I think one of the things that boards need to be aware of, and managements as well, is if the event occurs, what are they going to do and how are they going to recover from it? Because that becomes the important thing about the resilience of an organisation and that long term that I was talking about as well, rather than getting caught up in the short term with it.
How did you find out? Did you get a call in the middle of the night, or?
No. I got a call about midday on a Wednesday. I was in Noosa. It was 2 days before my daughter's wedding. And I got the call that no chair wants to get, which is to say we detected some unusual activity in our systems, and as a result we'd shut those systems down, and it unfolded from there. The way in which, for those that are interested, the way in which the trendy term that people use is threat actors. The actual term is criminals. The way the criminals actually contacted us was, believe it or not, they sent our CEO a WhatsApp message.
You said that the message for every board, I guess, is that you have to know how you're going to respond. Did Medibank have a system in place that included not paying a ransom, which you refused to do?
No. Like all boards, we had actually role-played different cyber scenarios, and I think the role-playing is important because you learn something new every time you do it. I think it becomes situational on whether you're going to pay a ransom or not. We balanced all of the factors and came to the conclusion that we wouldn't pay a ransom, but I could conceive of a situation where you would. If it was a life and death situation, I think you pay the ransom every time if there is some prospect that you're going to save a life. So it's horses for courses.
I suppose I want to put to you that what the information that you lost is, or not lost, the information that was accessed, that was laid bare of some of your customers, is the most personal information about drug use, mental health issues. How did that come into your, when you're sitting there as a board and you're discussing how you're going to do it, and you're taking it, it's a business issue, but it's so intensely personal?
Yeah, so we started with, and it was the focus all the way through, our customer wellbeing. That was the thing that became most important, and it was the thing that drove a lot of our decision making, and it drove the response. We put in place a number of responses to support our customers, particularly those who were most vulnerable and could have actually been affected by this. When you actually consider the amount of data that was stolen and then the amount that was actually joined up, so the numbers are that there was 9.7 million customer details, but they weren't joined up. The number of customer details that were actually joined up was less than 1,000, and the number of customer details that were disclosed in more detail than normal was about 2,500. So it was a significant subset, and whilst I'm not downplaying the importance of this, the issue was we could actually get our arms around those customers who were most vulnerable and look to protect them, and that was the thing that was important to us.
You've done a review, an independent review, Deloitte. You've accepted all the recommendations. You're not releasing it, you say, for security reasons. I mean, arguably that review is quite embarrassing. Is that a fair description?
I think that it's fair to say that a lot of the processes that we had in place were there and were appropriate. Deloitte made some recommendations for further improvements, and we had some of those in train this whole event anyway, but we've accelerated some of the other recommendations. And we continue to go back to exercising that muscle that I talked about earlier. We'll continue to actually say that there is going to be a further prospect of this happening, and I think any organisation or any individual that says it won't happen to them is kidding themselves, because the latest stats that I saw, which go to June last year, there was a cyber hack every 6 minutes in Australia in the year to June 2022, and I think that's just accelerated.
And of course, some of the issues that have been raised, there's been Medibank, Optus, Latitude, just some of the bigger ones, and the government is now looking at new regulations. Part of that is potentially banning the payment of a ransom. Christine, it's interesting because you sit on the board of AGL, which says the payment of a ransom shouldn't be banned. It could result in potential loss of life and catastrophic damage. Do you agree?
Yeah, and I think to Mike's point, firstly, let me just take a step back. When you're sitting around the board and you have to contemplate the challenges that Mike's just described, I suspect having some degree of certainty around decision making is always helpful. So I understand the government's position in terms of this suggestion of making payments of ransomware illegal. However, as Mike outlined, there has to be some degree of exceptions where if there is a threat of loss of life or there is catastrophic damage to infrastructure, critical infrastructure, then having some form of safe harbour or objective, clear exceptions needs to be contemplated. And I support the government's direction on that this is a partnership between the government and business. We can't do it on our own. Having that guidance, if the government is going to bring this into law, then it needs to make sure that it is there standing with business to guide, support and help along those guardrails of having those exceptions and those safe harbour, to ensure that when there is catastrophic loss of life or destruction of critical infrastructure, that there is some degree of discretion. And finally, I think these are not easy decisions, and I suspect that having a blunt instrument to kind of address this issue without consultation is not the way. In fact, the government's very clear; it's being very consultative in this whole process. So, I support the government's direction, however, with those caveats.
Rob, let me put to you, just because you haven't had a chance to respond to this, but a question from the audience. Beyond protecting the collected data, how are boards thinking about the ethical approach to the collection, retention and possibly even monetisation of data before you go to questions of protection? What's the data culture? I mean, that is the other side to this, isn't it? That we talk about cybersecurity, but there also has to be an element of managing how you keep and collect.
I think that is one of the absolute issues that we're all suddenly understanding. And just to give Mike Wilkins some credit, so he's been through that difficult experience, and a phone call 2 days before his daughter's wedding. And what Mike's done is given up his own personal time to visit many boards and help us understand what they'd done well, what they could have done better. And I think that goes to the whole data point. We don't know what we don't know in a lot of these situations. We're learning very quickly the talent that's required in organisations. We're all trying to grab cybersecurity experts. A lot of that talent came from overseas. The borders were shut for a number of years. So there's all these sort of completing factors. Data for me is the one that it sits there. Some of the latitude stuff was, this was data that was 10 or 15 years old. But I can't sit here and say any of our organisations, we are now, but any of our organisations 6 months ago had a good data retention policy and how we actually manage that. I think the risk is higher in B2C, so business to consumer, but even in B2B, I think the big fear for some organisations is if they can get into your operational facilities. Imagine getting into the Hilton Hotel and shutting the systems down, and I think that's the level where we're all concerned. We're not only concerned about the data, but the crossover between those systems, the core financial systems, the data systems, but all the operating systems in organisations. So it's a very complex area. We've all got good, terrific CIOs and teams working on this, but we're playing catch up, unfortunately.
So let me ask each of you, especially as Mike has been sharing, a lesson from Medibank's experience for you, Rob, as a chair and a director, and not the stuff that we'd all expect, that you have to be across what's going on in your organisation. What's something that Mike might have told you that actually surprised you or you hadn't thought about?
What surprised me, and it was a combination of Mike but also our own testing, was how easy it was to get into the organisation, not through APIs and all these complicated things, but to strip people's phones as they walked into the office, and also our security around people having the organisation name and 2020 in there, and how quickly the algorithms could run through the potential passwords of very senior people in the organisation, and suddenly they're in. That was the great learning for me of how easy it actually was through walking through the front door, I call it, not coming through the back door.
Christine?
Yeah, so very similar. And quite often when you hold the mirror to yourself as an organisation and try and understand what that cyber posture looks like, often we're doing Essential 8, we've got NIST framework, there's nothing to see here, and then you go and do a rigorous black box exercise, and you realise, to Rob's point, actually how simple it is to penetrate complete domain control within minutes, in some cases hours, nonetheless. So, and the social engineering, it doesn't even require, complicated de-encryption of data or passwords, just very simple, silly internal clicking of, so being very aware of that. And the other thing is that, the response plan, I've just recently done a couple of cyber simulation, and actually, to Mike's point, it's having that simulation exercise, but then realizing that, you can't be running around whilst you're in the midst of an attack, trying to find third-party providers, de-encryption providers. Have that set in place. Who are going to be the partners that are going to support you through this? Have a documented plan, be rigorous, test it. And those are the things that I'm constantly surprised at, how we don't do it often enough.
Mike, I've got a question here, a little cheeky, but potentially realistic. Is cyber risk insurance a growth opportunity for QBE?
Funny you should say that, Ali. Yes. Cyber insurance is growing internationally, and QBE does offer limited cyber insurance cover. We've just hired, though, a new head of cyber because we do see that there is an opportunity for this.
What'd you do with the old one?
Well, it wasn't that we were focusing on it. We offered incidental cyber cover as opposed to just specific standalone cyber cover. So yes, it's a growth opportunity, but I don't think anything actually prepares you for an attack. And the insurance will take away some of the financial pain, but the real benefit that you're able to get, and particularly for smaller organisations, is that you get access to expertise that you mightn't necessarily have on tap, whereas larger organisations can actually have those people on tap and lined up ahead of time.
I just, before I ask more questions from the audience, I just want to ask each of our directors about their own specific experiences on boards. And Christine, if I can start with you, because you had a slightly different passage onto the AGL board. You were nominated by Mike Cannon-Brooks's private company, Grok Ventures, and you were very much seen as not independent because of that nomination during the process of your run for that board. How do you, I suppose, prove your independence when you've been nominated to a board? And what was it like joining a party that you had not been invited to? You went on your own, I should say. You had a few other gate crashes.
Yeah, it's never fun. But notwithstanding the positive intent of a shareholder putting forward 4 candidates with the experience and skills to support a transition, I empathised and accepted that the optics were challenging and that actually the burden of proof, that the onus was entirely up to me to prove my independence. I absolutely accepted that, which is why I issued a statement of independence, first and foremost. But actually, most importantly, what I did was I offered myself up to the shareholders, institutional investors, proxies, super funds who had investments in AGL, to meet with me one-on-one, face-to-face or virtually, to prosecute, challenge, test the veracity of my candidacy, to test the integrity of my independence. No question was off the table. I felt that was really important for them to hear from me directly why I had chosen to put myself up for the opportunity and to do their own due diligence in arriving at a decision whether I was someone that deserved their vote and if I was someone that was going to stand up for the rights of all shareholders. And so I hoped that that investment in really spending time with them, for them to get to know me, was hopefully rewarded at the AGM, which it was. But really the most important test is now, through this being on the board and being able to demonstrate that I bring an independent mind that I'm not afraid to challenge respectfully, support management, but always act in the best interests of all shareholders. So, you know, I completely accept that there was all sorts of misconceptions and perceptions flying around, but at the end of the day, it was important for me to demonstrate that, you know, I stand as an independent and not on behalf of any shareholder.
And I never actually read this, and when you told me this, I was actually surprised. You've never met or spoken to Mike Cannon-Brookes.
That's correct.
It says rather a lot, doesn't it, about independence, I guess. Mike, let me, sorry, not Mike, Rob, I want to go to you next, because you came to the board of Boral at the time of that board's challenge from the now major shareholder, Kerry Stokes. So what's it like, and how do you maintain independence as a director on a board when you've got such a majority, you've got a majority owner, and in this case, a very outspoken majority owner?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one that exercises. How it unfolded was I'd agreed to join the board, and then SGH had bought 20% of the company, and I thought, well, hang on, what's their intention? So I met with Ryan Stokes, and I asked him what his intentions were and how he thought about the organisation, and actually what he said and the opportunity aligned with my own thinking. So there was a level of comfort that their intentions were absolutely aligned with the opportunity in the organisation. During that process, once I joined the board, about 6 months later, they launched a takeover for the company and went from 22% to 70%. But the independence of the board during that process was absolutely critical. So the SGH representatives stepped out of the room, the independent directors, of which there were 5, we went through the process of fighting them on behalf of shareholders. And we think we did a pretty good job maximising the opportunity for shareholders and got the price to a substantial premium. So I had a lot of comfort. Then the decision is, do I stick around? Because you've got a 70% shareholder and a bunch of independent directors. When you've been very successful in business, one of the most important things is your reputation. And what you find with the Seven Group and the Stokes family is their reputation is well above money. So when they say we want an independent board that challenges our thinking, that helps us improve the organisation, you take that at face value, but that's actually what has happened. So I've been happy to stay on that basis. I think the question remains is, when you're asked to do something that you don't feel is in the best interest of all shareholders, what do you do? And I said to Ali, that's why you shouldn't need the money. And I don't mean that in the way that, what I mean is you've got to be in a position not to be able to financially or any other way have an impact on you to protect the interest of all shareholders. And I think the same goes for politicians. The day you make a decision on the basis of not in the best of all constituents, then you have an issue. And I've never had a problem with the Boral board or the SGH ownership.
That does bring me to the issue of motivation, because if you're not in it for the money, and you can't afford to be in it for the money because you've got to be able to walk away, of course that's to a point, everyone has to earn a living,
yeah.
But if you're not in it for the money, what are you in it for?
So I think in it for the money means that you don't let the money sit above your principles, and it's just a term. It doesn't. I think you're in it to help organisations, you're in it to help improve business in Australia, you help to grow the economy, all of those sort of much more social things than people realise. And I think the best directors are those that come with a mindset of, I want to help this organisation be better, I want to help this organisation grow, rather than I want to be on a board.
Christine, do you think that that's the way most directors approach the role of being on a board?
I hope that is the way, and I think Rob has articulated it beautifully. That is exactly, certainly I can talk for myself that that is precisely why, I can't understand why else you'd want to be on a board.
Because it's not so much fun?
Yeah. But, the fact of the matter is that if you decide that you want to have a purpose in this stage of your career, and that purpose means that helping organisations be a better version of themselves and to the term that you're going to be there, then that is precisely why, to the point that Rob's made, that directors, I hope, choose to be on boards.
Mike, and I imagine that that's why you stepped up at AMP when required. What was that like when you stepped in as acting CEO and chair, and especially that 2018 shareholders meeting that was pretty rabid? I imagine that probably comes close to maybe that experience a couple of days before your daughter's wedding, getting that phone call, because that was a fairly hefty, nasty 90 minutes. Didn't put you off corporate life, did it? But what did you take away from that?
Well, Ali, I agree with what Rob and Christine have said about the motivations for being on a board, and I think when an organisation is facing some difficulty and you believe that you can help, and more particularly in a board scenario, your colleagues believe that you might be able to help, you've got a responsibility to try to do that. So I felt that responsibility very strongly for the shareholders, for the people of the organisation, and for the organisation itself and its customers. The annual general meeting was interesting. First annual general meeting that I'd actually chaired, so that was okay. But I think in all situations, doesn't matter whether you've got a company that's got some issues at the time or whether things are running smoothly. It's about actually the shareholders being able to have their say, to ask their questions, and it's important that they're treated with respect through that. And that was the attitude that I tried to bring to that annual general meeting, and the attitude that I try to bring to all of the meetings that I have.
A personal question, because you were part of the board that then put David Murray into place, and everyone in this room knows what happened after that. What was that like, to watch your succession plan essentially take a company from bad to worse?
Well, that's your characterisation.
Well, the share price was down 60% from the day he took the job to the day he left it.
Yeah, well, I'm not on the board, so I can't speak about a number of the decisions that were made there. What we did try to do was to put someone that we felt had significant experience in the sector that we were involved with, and that was able to affect some change in the organisation. Am I disappointed with what's happened with AMP? Yes, because I think it's a great Australian organisation, but it is still here, and that demonstrates the strength of the organisation as well. And the important thing was that as a board, we were able to go forward and to preserve that organisation for the interests of all of its stakeholders.
A question here from the audience, which I start with you, Christine, but it's a really good broader point. How are boards reacting or conversations shifting now that investors are prepared to vote against directors at AGMs and propose new directors? So they've used the example of Woodside and BP, but I guess the general theme is you have a far more activist shareholder base now. How does that change board conversations?
I'm not sure about changing board conversations. It's more about being aware that you're accountable. I think accountability as directors for the quality of the decision making, to ensure that you don't shirk the responsibilities that go with the duties that you're required to perform on a board, to have the level of discussion that's required, and to have the rigour and discipline and integrity around some of the issues that need to be dealt with. And I think that what's occurred over the last few years is hopefully an opportunity for directors to hold themselves to account. And I personally welcome the accountability that directors should and need to have in carrying out their duties. So I'm not sure it sort of has necessarily it's on the agenda as such, but it's more about making sure that we now understand that there is another way, and that at come AGM, if there is issues that an organisation is not addressing, to the level that is needed, then there's a pathway for change.
Rob, do you think there's maybe not a change, as Christine says, but is there a greater lens on accountability now?
For boards and management, absolutely. And I think that's a good thing. I think the lens that's put on organisations is, particularly public organisations, I think in some respects they're an easier target because by their very nature they are public, but there's a level of community expectations which has certainly increased across the world in terms of how corporate citizens should act, how people should be treated, how culture in organisations used to be something that you talked about in the HR meetings, but actually that's the bones of the organisation. I think people are able to vote with their feet. In times gone by, and people suffered in organisations because they didn't have maybe as much opportunity to move. So that all goes into the accountability of directors. It's much more than just the financial capability of the organisation or the share price. It's, have you got a good culture? Have you got a good employee engagement? All of those much richer issues that make organisations successful.
Mike, let me put this question to you. Investors are forever asking boards for more information about climate change strategies, plans, etc. What information would you or would boards like their investors to be providing to assist with the transition of their companies? I'm actually betting investors give you all the information you want, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I suspect you're a little wrong with that, Ali.
Oh,
but yeah.
Of course.
Boards are increasingly actually looking at what their impact on climate is and how that is playing out. I think that it goes back to one of the comments I made to an earlier question. It's about this longer term. And it's actually understanding from investors what their tolerance for risk is, or what their tolerance is for change over the medium to longer term. And understanding that becomes important. And I think the way in which you can do that is almost going to what Rob and Christine were talking about, and that's engaging with all of your stakeholders, because the shareholders are important, but the customer base, the broader community is also important, and actually having that engagement and being prepared to have an open discussion, accepting that you might not always agree, but at least you're aware of that. Because I think if you don't have that, then really what you're doing is you're firing a dart at a target that may not be the right target.
Robert, a question for you. Given heavy industries that you've been involved in, how are you assessing your company's need to allocate capital to decarbonisation-related R&D versus waiting for technological advances to enable decarbonisation plans? And that really goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that you all have the targets, but you don't necessarily know how you're going to get there.
The way we do it is we scour around the world. There's a lot of potential opportunities that are evolving because everyone's on this journey and technological change has been very positive. I also think there's a lot of noise around potential opportunities that aren't as big as people think, and I think that sometimes gets too much airplay. I think the other point to think about is if we want a very good manufacturing base in Australia, whether it's making cement or glass bottles or building high-rise towers, then there's a natural embodied carbon in all of those processes. And I think just simply moving those industries offshore is not a solution. That's what actually happened. A lot of companies in Europe just simply moved their production facilities to the Middle East or Eastern Europe. And I think one of the challenges for us as a country is to make sure that we protect what we're really good at, that manufacturing base, that aluminium production, whatever those things are, and we use the best technology in the world to transition and do that economically.
Christine, do you have a thought on that question?
Yeah, I think I agree with one of the points that Rob made, that sometimes people think that there is a lot more opportunities now. You should be doing this and you should be doing that, and look at this, and hydrogen is a great example of that. But actually the reality is that sometimes it's challenging to put in practice or bring certain innovations into your organisations at the pace and at the level of investment that's required. So, you know, I think being very clear, again, going back to the conversation we had earlier, which is being very clear about what are the relevant and meaningful climate impacts that your organisation has, and then really embedding that into the strategy and working out what are the things that you need to do to decarbonise, and give yourself a timeline that's absolutely realistic and ambitious, and being very clear about how is it that you're going to get there and the investment that you're going to need. But be transparent and obviously monitor progress, and then pivot and change as technology comes on board, where you go, oh, okay, actually this has gone faster, like battery storage or generation of renewables. Then you just kind of pivot your strategy and your investment accordingly.
Mike, a question for you specifically here. What's the impact of AI on Medibank and QBE's white-collar employees and on cybersecurity? And can AI support or replace, directors?
They could certainly be smarter than us, couldn't they?
Up to a point, maybe.
But probably a couple of years out of date just at the moment, Rob, which could be said about a few of us, I suppose. But no, I think it's going to enhance just the power and the capacity that AI brings to actually enhance the customer experience, and really to actually enhance the working experience for our employee base is something I think we should be embracing. It's something that we are looking at in all the organisations that I'm involved in. But I don't see that it's actually going to be this devil that, you know, if you go back 15, 20 years, there was this perception that technology was going to take over and people's jobs would be redundant. Well, the reality is the jobs haven't been made redundant. They've actually morphed, and people are doing more worthwhile work. And I think that AI actually just enables them to continue to be able to do that.
Do you worry, though, all three of you on your boards, you've seen various, in fact, there's just been one in the last 24 hours of the so-called founder of AI warning. Do you worry that our regulatory systems are not going to keep up, that we're not necessarily keeping a handle on where we're at with AI?
Well, look, I think one of the things that boards need to discuss is where their position sits from AI and the ethical position that they're going to take with AI, and that really goes to the culture of the board and the position that it wants to have vis-a-vis its customers and its other key stakeholders. And on that basis, I think there'll be self-regulation, even if governments or other regulators are not quite keeping up with the changes that are occurring.
Any thoughts on AI? No, not particularly, or?
I think I agree with Mike in the sense that self-regulation, but I think this is moving so quickly, and there is an opportunity for the government, or any government for that matter, to really look at some of the very fundamental ethical questions and kind of address them sooner than later. But because I think that this can run away from us before we know it, and then it's...
So you do worry about that?
I absolutely worry about it, but I'm also, I love technology, and I think let's focus on, the really great stuff that AI can do for our businesses. I just sat through a couple of demonstrations over the last 4 weeks, and I can assure you in one of them, a task that takes an organisation 3 days was done in seconds. So there is enormous productivity gains in using AI in a positive and constructive way, but I am genuinely concerned about some of the moral issues and some of the ethical issues in applications where we are going to need guidelines, and I think the sooner the government sort of looks at this and provides some guardrails, it's going to help businesses to actually continue adopting AI in a constructive and positive way.
We are almost out of time, but earlier today we had a session where we heard about The Voice from Marcia Langton, and also indeed in our Welcome to Country this morning. So I wanted to ask each of you, have your organisations taken a position on The Voice, and how do you see the role for your organisations, if indeed you do see a role for your organisations in the referendum? Rob, if I can ask you.
Thanks. I'll start with a comment that I think after talking about 20 years about constitutional recognition, to miss this opportunity would be a real tragedy for Australia. We've got a 6-week parliamentary inquiry, and let that do its work. I think where we end up is, as organisations, is at the very least providing information and education to our teams, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of different sides of the argument. So we haven't yet formed a view. We're certainly discussing it at our boards, but we haven't formed a view whether we'd come out publicly as an organisation. But certainly everyone believes let's not miss an opportunity and make sure that everyone who gets to vote in the referendum, and a lot of those will be our employees, have all the information they need to make the right decision.
Christine?
Same. Most of my organisations haven't taken a position. I hope in due course we do. I think the important part in all of this is that the directors, boards, management need to provide a safe environment to listen, learn and inform themselves about what this means. At a personal level, like Rob, I believe it's a really important and historic opportunity for us to bring constitutional change, and I look forward to supporting the First Nations people in their journey through the Voice Treaty and the opportunity for truth-telling.
Mike?
Yeah, so all the organisations I'm involved with, and personally, we're all supportive of the spirit of the Uluru Statement from the heart, and I think most of corporate Australia is in that position as well. What we want to do is, as Rob said, equip our people to make the most informed decision that they can. And the thing that we're encouraging is that the debate that occurs is actually a constructive and respectful debate, rather than people just taking to their corners out of sometimes misplaced ideology. So we're continuing to support all of that, and look forward to what the Australian people ultimately decide, because I'm sure that they will take a well-informed decision, and that's what they deserve.
We're out of time, but I want to give each of you literally 10 seconds and a question without notice. But I'd like to finish panel on a note of optimism. What's exciting you? What's actually exciting you right now? Rob?
Oh, I think Australia is just such a fantastic place to live and bring up families, and with this rich tapestry of immigration that we've got coming into the country just makes us stronger and better. So I just get very excited about Australia's opportunity, with some challenge around housing and transition and all those sort of things.
You know, this is the optimistic bit. We're just doing the...
Yeah, exactly. Full stop, Ali.
Christine?
I've just come back from a work trip in the Netherlands and Germany, and when I touched down back home in Sydney last week, I was so grateful to be home to a country that's given me personally the opportunity to thrive and flourish. And now that the gates of immigration have opened up, I'm sure that a similar experience is going to be shared with those. And this is, as Rob said, is a country of opportunity. I'm so excited, and that's one of the key reasons why I do what I do, because there's so much opportunity in almost every business. In fact, every business I'm involved with, and I can't wait.
Mike?
Yeah, similar. I think the opportunity that is here, over the years I've been fortunate to live in a number of countries. I've never found a better one than this one to live in, so I keep coming back to it. But also I'm encouraged by just the passion of some of our younger people that are now starting to come into the workforce, and the different views that they're actually bringing. And that's promoting discussion as well, including around board tables about how we might actually reinvent that work, thinking about things such as AI and other stuff, but how we actually might reinvent work for the future rather than continuing to deal with what served us well in the past.
And how was your daughter's wedding?
It was great, and the good news was I said to the guys, because we were talking morning and evening about the progress, I said, look, if you give me the night off, that'd be really good, which they did. So.
Please join me in thanking our directors and chairs very much for their insights.